Hello everyone, my name's Brendan Owen and I'm going to run through you the process I took in designing this puzzle that you can see on the screen. And this was inspired from a YouTuber called Devon. I want to start with the basic building block of my puzzle, and what I'm going to do is build a cube, and then from that cube I'm going to change it and it's going to actually end up being looking like a squashed cube. So the way I do this is I start with a 20 by 20 sketch, and then I'm going to extrude that out into a 20 by 20 by 20 cube. So I'm going to extrude this out in a symmetrical way, and this is also going to have a height of 20 millimeters. So this will create a perfect cube, and from this point what I'd like to do is I'd like to pull out the edges, like extrude them, but I want to taper the angle in by negative 45 degrees, and what that will do is create all these pyramids on the end of the faces. So I'm going to work my way through all of the faces. Now I can extrude that out past 10, and then but the negative 45 taper, what that will do is we'll just basically limit the scope of that extrude. So I may be a bit free and easy with the extrude from this point, so I'm just going to work my way through it. There's various ways you can change the settings here. You can use the handle there to change the taper, or you can get in the dialog that comes off to the side and change the distance there. So I'm changing that to 100 or 10, it doesn't really matter, because the taper angle will sort of taper that off and to a point pretty much 10 from the height. Given that the original cube was 20 by 20 by 20, the taper length is only going to reach 10. So I'm going to work my way through that, and eventually I'll get all the faces creating these points. And then what you can see is when I create those 2 points, the faces of those pyramids join with the other faces and they actually create these rhombuses. So this actually creates a 12-sided figure with the rhombuses on each of the side. So I guess it's a rhombic dodecahedron. So what I'm doing now is I'm actually creating 2 of these rhombic dodecahedrons, because the dodecahedron is not what I want as my final shape. What I want is this sort of squashed cube. So what I've done is I've overlapped those along that edge. So I've stretched it along that edge so that it perfectly sort of aligns, and now I'm combining them and using the intersect, and it's that intersect that actually creates this squashed cube, and 4 of those squashed cubes actually create that rhombus dodecahedron. So this is what I'm going to use. I've got rid of the origin because I don't want that polluting my next assembly. Just save that off, it's called finished. And now at this point I'm actually going to start creating the pieces. So this is the basic building block of my pieces. So what I'm doing now is I'm actually going to create a number of components, and each component will be one of the pieces. So I'm going to work my way through just creating these sort of placeholders for my 4 pieces. So it's a 4-piece puzzle, which you saw at the start of the video, and each of those pieces will actually combine together to form basically it's a 12-sided figure. You'll see it in the end. It's basically like a chopped off rhombic dodecahedron, I guess. So at this point what I'm going to do now is actually import one of those building blocks from my other design. So this is actually going to link it in, and at this point what I'm going to do is copy it with the shortcut key, and I'm going to paste it in. So that's actually a quicker way than trying to import each of one of these in, so you can just copy and paste within the same design. So they're all still linked to the original design, but at this point I've got 5 of them very quickly, and I'm going to basically copy all 5 and paste them into each of those other pieces. So I'm working my way down each of those pieces and pasting those in there. So if you expand those out, you'll see that those blocks are in there as well, and they're linked as well. At this point I've discovered the component name was wrong, so I need to change that as well. So I'm going to change that to piece 4 now. So you can see that also has that 5 building blocks. So at this point all of those building blocks are overlapping with each other, so you can't really see them. They've been placed in the same spot. So at this point I'm going to hide all the other pieces, and I'm actually going to start constructing my shape. So what I'm going to do is basically take that first piece, drag it over to the side, and I'm going to use that as where I'm going to build on my piece. So at this point I need to capture the position, and I'm going to click on the piece that I want to move. So there's 4 other pieces in there. Just clicking on one will only select one of them, and I'm just selecting that join position, and it's in the middle of that face. So what I'm doing is actually joining those 2 faces together so they line up perfectly. They're the same building block. And what I'm trying to do is build my first piece. Now I know what the piece looks like because I've got it sitting on my desk, and what I'm going to do is slowly build it up, joining those faces. So you saw that the first face joined on sort of in this sort of linear fashion so that the pieces sort of all line up. This one is actually the other orientation, so you can rotate it by 180 degrees. So as you work through, Fusion will decide which one it is, and sometimes you need to change them over. So at this point I'm nearly all the way through. I'm just going to link on that last shape, and I'm going to click on the face on that other piece where I want to place it, so they'll join up there. So at this point I'm happy with all that orientation, so I can check with that piece on my desk and make sure that it's the same. So at this point I can hide that piece away. I'm going to work my way through all the other pieces using a very similar technique. So basically going to repeat what I've just done. I'm going to move one of the building blocks out of the way. I need to capture its position, and that's automatic when you actually try and do a join and if you've moved a piece. So I'm going to click on the piece I want to move to the piece I want it to move to. So at this point I wasn't happy with the way it joined. I want them to line up, so I've rotated it by 180 degrees, and that's sort of lined up there. So at this point I've really got to try and look at the piece and work out which way it's orientated and try and get that association on the screen. Because of that squashed nature of this puzzle, it's actually quite tricky, and you'll see as I work through this process that I'm going to make mistakes. It's not going to line up the way I want it, but it's sort of this process of making a few mistakes, going back, fixing it up, and eventually you get to where you want to be. So at this point I'm sort of working my way through it, just slowly building up each of those blocks one at a time until I have the 5 blocks in the positions that I want, and then I'll move on to the next piece. So you can see here that's actually lined up not even the way I want it. So it needs to be rotated by 90 degrees even just to get the faces to align. So that's what I've done at this point. And then there's that last shape that I need to sort of tack on to that second last piece that I've placed. I'm just again looking at the piece, looking at what's on the screen, just trying to make sure that what I've lined up there is correct. Sometimes it's a bit deceiving. At this point this is the wrong way, so I'm going to have to rotate it at some point. Actually no, looks like it's correct, this one. So this is my second piece. Now so I'm going to work through piece 3, same sort of thing, go through that process. So I won't talk to you about this process, you can just watch it as it runs through. But I wanted to talk to you a little bit about how I designed this original puzzle. So what I did when I was actually building this puzzle was I wrote a computer program and then encoded this building block into it. And what the program did was actually automatically take 5 of those blocks and work out all the possible combinations, and it generated 100 or so, I think it's 100, it might even be thousands of these shapes. That possible shapes, possible ways of combining these these 5 squashed cubes to generate a new shape, with the rules that the faces must align and they must not intersect and things like that. And so that's what the program did. It sort of generated in a computer, I guess, sort of a computer representation of all these shapes. And then what I did was I took those shapes and then tried all the possible combinations of fitting them into this other shape that was actually made of 20 of those building blocks. So it went through and found out all the possible solutions, worked out the subset of pieces that needed to go into that, and then what that did is actually generate all these sort of puzzles that I could have picked from. Now there was thousands. So what I needed to do is sort of narrow that down into a more friendly sort of puzzle. And the way I did it was I actually looked at the assembly. I looked at how these pieces slotted together, and I tried to come up with a solution that the pieces all slotted in a particular order. And there was only one way of joining these pieces, only one way of sliding those pieces together. And you would have seen that at the start of the video, how those pieces slide together in a particular order. And I did that to increase the challenge of the puzzle. So you might get two pieces together, but it might not be the right time to put them together. And so that added some challenge to the puzzle. But the other thing is once that last piece locks in, the puzzle just sort of stays together. It doesn't fall to pieces like some of the other designs would have. So that was part of the challenge, and I filtered that process. And eventually I came up with this set of 4 pieces that built this puzzle. And I got it built out of wood. So I sent the designs off to a woodworker, and they built it with wood. And that came back to me. So I've got this wood piece. Now that was 10 years ago. So the glue had broken by that stage, so I'd lost a couple of the blocks, so it wasn't quite the same. It was nearly there, but it was enough for me to redesign it in this process that I'm doing at the moment, and use this modern technology of Fusion 360, and also using my 3D printer to actually build this puzzle again from scratch. And this is what I'm excited about, and I guess Devon's video got me excited about actually designing these puzzles again and making them. Using those programs that I've got in the past and dug those all up and sort of got them going again, and trying to design some new puzzles. Some of them are going to be based off these shapes, some are going to be based off other shapes. But what I want to do is actually use these and print them out and make something that will work. So at this point, I'm nearly there. So I've put all the pieces together into a shape that I'm happy with. So each of the pieces are at a point where all the building blocks are that, and it looks the same as the puzzle that I've got sitting on my desk. At this point, I want to double check that this is actually going to make a usable puzzle. So, I'm going to actually try and put these pieces back together again. In order to do that, I need to separate them out, so I've got them all visually shown at the same. So while I was building them, they were all overlapping each other, so I just sort of extracted them out. Now at this point, I'm just going to change the appearance and give them a sort of plastic look of different colours. So I'm just going to work my way through each of those pieces, and then give this one blue, and then we move on to the green, and just work my way through each of the pieces. So I've got some sort of visual association with each of the pieces. So when I put it together, you can see which one goes where. So at this point, you can see all the pieces are different. What I want to do now is get rid of those internal joins, because that's mucking up the look a little bit, and it's going to be distracting once I start actually joining these other shapes together. So what I'm going to do now is actually work my way through, try and visualize how these pieces go together. So I've ordered the pieces in a way that I know they go in a particular order, so I know that piece 1 will join with piece 2. So at this point, I'm trying to actually work out what is piece 1 and what is piece 2. So I've selected that. You can see that piece 1 is the blue. And at this point, I think piece 2 is the green. So I'm going to select that. At this point, I'm trying to orientate it in a way so I can work out which faces go where. So this is a little bit tricky. So I'm basically just trying to find 2 faces that will go together. And if I use a joint on them, it will bring them together. Now, what I found here is I've done this wrong. So I've basically just trying to join that piece with another piece. I think we actually clicked the wrong thing, so it's not actually working correctly at the moment. So I'm just going to work my way through that and actually try and construct this thing 3D. Now, I could have taken these pieces and just print them as is. Well, I would have aligned them, and I've got a process where I'll show you how I do that. But I could have just printed them as is so that, see what's going on. At this point, I think that the green is going to join with the blue at this stage. When I actually do it, I find that that's the wrong way. It should have been twisted slightly. So I've selected the 2 faces to go together, so that's not what I want. And what that's doing is I've got to start again, basically. So the beauty of a software program is I can start again and try again. try and re-look at my puzzle, try and work out where they're going to go to this time. So I'm going to have another shot at that. They're the two faces I think it should join. Now I think that it should be rotated 180 degrees. I know sort of what I'm trying to get to, so I can do that. So you can see that they've come in nicely. Now you can see that green piece should slot into the blue piece there, and it's going to come in from the top there. So I'm happy with that join. Now I'm going to try and get this red piece in, and hopefully that's going to fit in between the green and the blue there. So I'm just again trying to find out the two faces that should go together. So the red piece is the piece I want to move, so that's the one I selected first. Now I'm just trying to work out which faces should go. So select that one. Now that to me looks okay, so joining again. So you can see that how that red piece could have slotted in between the blue and the green there. At this point I've just got that one yellow piece that's going to slot in there and lock that piece together, lock that puzzle together to form the final shape. So again, working through it, trying to find a face that I can visually see where it will go to. Click on that. That's going to be the wrong orientation, so I need to rotate it by 180 degrees, and it looks like that's locking us together. So you can see that's the final shape that you would have seen at the start of the video. Now at this point I actually want to show how to print it. So what I'm going to do is just, I like that assembly, I'm going to keep that as it is, but I want to be able to print this thing out. So there's a couple of things I need to do here. So what I'm going to do is just bring it back a bit. So I'm saving out another copy. I'm actually going to take it back in the timeline so that I can delete some of that assembly, because I actually want to reassemble it in a way that makes more sense from a printing point of view. So at this point, there's something else I need to do. What I need to do is I need to shrink some of those faces down, because if I print this out as is, it's going to be so tight. There's no tolerances there at the moment. I've made it sort of perfectly mathematically correct, so that if you had a perfect tolerance, you could fit it all together, but that's not how it works in the physical world. So what we need to do is reduce it down a bit. So what I've done is, what I'm going to try and do is just make each of these pieces one construction. So what I'm doing at the moment is I need to unlink one of the blocks, because what I want to do is actually join that with all the other blocks, so I make one physical body, and then that body is the one I'm going to operate on in actually just shrinking down those faces, so that just by a tiny bit, not visually anything different, but what it will do is it will allow the space, so when they're joining together physically, they'll actually mesh nicely and it won't interfere with each other. So at the moment what I need to do is just unlink each of those, and I'm joining them up together. So what I'm doing is I just need to unlink one of them, because that's the one that I'm going to build on. I'm going to keep all the other blocks the same. Now, one of the disadvantages of unlinking them is if I change the original one, this won't follow through, but I'm sort of happy with the block. I don't think the block's going to change. It's a fundamental building block to these shapes, so I'm not worried about changing. I don't think I'm going to change the size of that or the look of it. There's various things I could have done to it. I could have put some rounded corners on it and things like that, but I found that when I printed it like that, it just had all sorts of problems with supports and things like that. So I've just kept it clean and sharp. I'm hiding away all those blocks now. I've combined them together, so it sort of looks the same as before, but now it's just one body, and what I can do is start operating on this body. So at this point I only really want to select the faces, so I'm going in here and just selecting my priority of faces. So at this point I can just select all the faces. I'm going to use a press pull. Now for some reason I got rid of all my faces, but I can reselect them. But the beauty of doing that checkbox earlier is now that I drag over it, I can select all the faces at once. So what I've done there is I've just shrunk the faces. So I've shrunk the faces just 0.2 of a millimeter. So it's tiny. It's it's only one layer in your print, so that it's very tiny, and I think 0.2 is about right. It can change a little bit. So at this point I'm selecting all the faces. I'm using the offset faces, and I got to that with a push-pull. So again I'm doing minus 0.2, and that will just shrink things down again. So I'm just applying that to all of the pieces. So they're just all shrinking down a little bit, just on those exposed faces. So any of the faces that join with another piece won't interfere with each other and it will just sort of slot in nicely. So again, I'm working through all the pieces, all the faces, and then just sort of bringing that down a bit until we got a sort of decent size. So it's very hard to see here what is actually changing. But if I sort of zoom in into a section, you can start seeing some of that little difference in there, just in these little corners. So you can see that that's not flush anymore. You can see some of the faces have reduced in size. And this push-pull will help me do that. So I'm down to the last piece now. So at this point, basically doing the same thing, selecting push-pull, selecting all the faces. For some reason it selected the edges at this point, even though the faces are what I wanted. Let's just select one face, do a push-pull again, and then I can select all the faces, which undid the other one, but anyway. We end up with all the faces. Again, we reduce it by 0.2 of a millimeter, so a tiny decrease, but now we're in a position we've got all our pieces and they've all been shrunk on the faces, so any of the joining faces will have enough room so that when I put the puzzle together it should all fit nicely, and when I did print this it sort of printed nicely. So what I'm doing now is just creating a base. So what I want to do is orientate all of these in a way that they'll print in a way that I'm happy with. So at this point I got in a bit of a muddle. I basically trying to select that base plate, right? So I'm trying to select that I guess the plane, the origin plane, and I'm just selecting and trying all my might just to try and select this. It wouldn't let me select it. It got a little bit frustrating. It's always a bit tricky when you're trying to create a video and things aren't working right, but I sort of discovered in the end what it was is when I went across and changed my selection filter, one of the things you can select is those planes. So at this point I just want to make sure I save it, so in case anything goes wrong, I've done my clearance at this point. So at some point I'll have a realization it was actually what I've made a mistake, and I can go and correct that. So so I'm hoping I work out what it is. I'm trying various ways of trying to select that base thing because I need it to build my sketch, and the sketch is going to be that. And so at this point I've realized what it is, realized that none of my selection filters are there, so I need to basically let them all get selected, so now I can select that bottom face. So that was very frustrating, but you live and learn. So next time that happens I might be a bit more aware of what's going on. So now I can create a sketch off that plane. Once I've selected it, I'm just going to create an arbitrary thing. I don't really care too much about the dimensions, just at a rough spread. So I'm going to put it on each of those edges, the joins. So I'm just sort of roughly placing in a rough sort of separation of those pieces. So I've just created a base plate there. At this point I'm going to ground it because I want that to stay the same. I've pushed it down below the origin because I want all of these pieces to live above, in a positive Z way. So now I'm just trying to find a piece and trying to have a look at the pieces and try and decide what sort of orientation I need to give this so that they can actually be printed without support. Now this one sort of placed down, and I think I got some of the base there, and you'll actually see underneath there's actually a line touching the base plate, so it actually spreading out from that line, even though the degrees are alright for a print, so I can print upwards and it builds on itself. The problem with that line is that I ended up needing a I guess what it's called, that thing on the base, I can't even think, the support down the bottom, whatever it's called. You can put it in the comments. I'll probably work it out after this video. I know what the name is, but I can't remember off the top of my head. So at this point I'm just going through all the faces and trying to work out what sort of orientation that I need to do that. You'll notice that red piece is going to require support. I couldn't work out an orientation to place that could do without support. So it's not ideal having support, but you've got to deal with it sometimes. It creates a bit of a rough surface, but most of the other pieces didn't need that support. That was the only one that I struggled with to actually find an orientation that didn't have the support. So now we're at a position where they're all centered on the origin with a positive Z. So I'm just going to finish this at this point and thank you. Now it's we've finished the pieces. What we're actually going to do is save this out as an STL file. So I actually don't need the base, so I'm going to hide that and select all the pieces. But I want to save each of the pieces out as a separate file, so I'm going to select that, click OK, and at this point I need to find a location for it. So this is some of the work that I've done in actually creating this video and saving out the pieces. I'm just going to store this in a separate directory, give it some sort of base name, and what it's going to do is save each of the pieces out one at a time. So for some reason it seemed fairly slow, so what I've done is I'll just show you the directory. It's slowly filling that out. Each of the shapes are getting saved out one at a time as an STL file, and then what we can do is bring each of those into Cura and actually, you know, create some G code, which at this point we can push off to the printer and you know, print some of these things, so we now have a physical puzzle. And once I get rid of the raft and the you know, supports and maybe sand it down a little bit, you know, the pieces can all fit together and create an interesting puzzle. So what I'll show you now is just the actual puzzle printing, just quickly. So that's on the rafts there with all the pieces, and then this is the final assembled piece with a little stand underneath there, and then these are sort of the disassembled piece where you can see the stand in the background. I hope you found this video informative and you learnt something. I certainly learnt a lot actually creating this puzzle, and I hope you have a go and try and print it out. Thank you. Bye.